right, welcome football fans to a Tuesday episode of the Call Sheet Daily podcast here at the Fans First Sports Network. I'm your host, Kevin Smith. Tuesday episode, June 17th. Going to take a little bit of a different tact with today's show because this is an interesting day in American history. And we're going to talk about football, yeah, kind of. But we're going to talk about an issue related beyond the sport, attached to a very important figure in football history, an even larger figure in America's cultural history now, and really the significant impact that this particular event has had on American culture. It is fascinating when we think about it. June 17th. June 17th is notable for a lot of different reasons. It was the day that the Battle of Bunker Hill, which essentially started the Revolutionary War, was fought. That's a big deal. It's the date that on this date in 1974, 5 men were arrested for breaking into the Democratic headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., planting listening devices. Those 5 employees turned out to be associates of President Richard Nixon, to loosely work in his White House under a secret group. They called themselves the Plumbers. Their job was to fix leaks in the Nixon administration. They got caught bugging the Democratic headquarters in an affair that would ultimately lead to Nixon's resignation. That's not new, though, political corruption. Watergate's only notable because it actually took down the president. But as far as scandals go, it's kind of low level. And we have much more impactful political scandals throughout our history than Watergate. Nixon just happened to get busted, which is why Watergate became so notorious. But the event I'm speaking about today took place on June 17th, today's date, 1994. And I will set the scene for you. I was about 24 years old. It was the end of the school year. I was in my second or third year as a teacher. And so, of course, mid-June meant that school was about to get out. The best part of my life was about to ensue. Summer vacation when you're in your 20s, that's a great time. The NBA finals were on. The New York Knicks were playing the Houston Rockets. It was a great finals matchup because you had 2 titans in the game of basketball, Patrick Ewing and Hakeem Olajuwon, matched up against one another. And some friends of mine and I headed out because it was a Saturday night. We headed out to a bar and we wanted to shoot some pool and watch the game. And again, Saturday night, mid-June, I live in a resort area, bars packed, loud, tons of people there, shooting pool, having a couple beers, watching the finals. And then subtly, I noticed that a couple of the TVs, they were in a bar. There's probably a dozen TVs all showing the NBA finals. A couple of them had switched over to something else. And I didn't know what it was. It was really hard to what are we looking at here? There was a white SUV, which would of course turn out later to be the famous white Bronco, the Ford Bronco. We talk about it like it's the white whale, the great white whale. The white Ford Bronco moving at a fairly slow pace down what looked like a bunch of freeways. Cars that had been on those freeways pulled over on the sides of the road, and about 40 police cars trailing this Bronco in what was being described as a low-speed chase. And again, very subtle at first. You just kind of happen to look up and this TV's not showing the basketball game anymore. It's just showing this slow-speed car chase. Whatever. You go back to talking, playing pool. You look up a little bit later. Now all the TVs are tuned to this low-speed chase. And before long, the entire bar got silent. I mean, we're talking about a crowded bar at the Jersey Shore on a Saturday night in June. That is a festive atmosphere, to say the least. And suddenly it had grown dead quiet, where the 100 or so people in the bar were all just standing there, not saying a word, not speaking, holding their drinks and gazing up at the TVs, the volume of which had now been turned up. And you are listening to the commentary as they take you through the now famous, or perhaps I should say infamous, O.J. Simpson Bronco chase through the streets, the freeways around Los Angeles. And the intrigue was significant because there were reports that OJ had a gun to his head in the back of the car, that he wanted to commit suicide, that the driver of the car, which turned out to be his old teammate Al Cowlings, was in negotiations with the police. Was it going to end in a shootout? It was one of the most fascinating and intriguing live action scenarios I had ever seen in my life. If you talk to people like me who are old enough to remember that night, it's weird. It is on the short list of significant events that you'll never forget, where you were, who you were with, or what you were doing when it occurred. I've talked about how for my generation, I think 9/11 is the signature event in that particular respect. How for my parents' generation, it's probably the Kennedy assassination. But outside of 9/11 and maybe a couple of other things, like January 6th, I remember that very, very clearly as a government teacher who was teaching a government class when that was going down. That was memorable. And I remember being younger, the Challenger exploding and the significance of that. But the O.J. Simpson Bronco chase stands out as one of the ultimate memories of where were you, what were you doing, who were you with when it happened in my life. And that's probably true for a lot of people listening. But that was just the beginning of an affair that would fundamentally change America. So let's talk about how. How now, 31 years later, O.J. Simpson, who passed away not too long ago, and the subsequent trial of him for the murder of his ex-wife and a friend of hers, the unfortunate Ronald Goldman. How has that really changed America? How has it changed celebrity? How has it changed athletes and the way that they're viewed and the way that they're put under a microscope? How's it changed our culture? I think if you didn't grow up before the internet, this is really hard to wrap your brain around. But you have to understand, before the internet, the O.J. Simpson affair, this is the Bronco chase, June 17th, 1994, and the trial would last through much of 1995. You didn't have 24/7 news. CNN had really just become a thing in the late 1980s. And by 1994, I mean, it was kind of this niche news outlet that it didn't have enough content to fill 24/7 news. So they just kept running the same stuff over and over again. And the O.J. Simpson affair, the trial in particular, was the greatest gift CNN ever could have received, because it allowed them to fill their airways with new and, to the American public at least, interesting content on a daily basis. I mean, the O.J. Simpson case, more than anything, launched the 24/7 news cycle, the endless news cycle. The O.J. Simpson case launched the notion that if you just call this thing breaking news, people will think it's important. Breaking news used to be something of major significance. The LAPD chasing a fugitive O.J. Simpson through the highways of Los Angeles. That's breaking news. But an interview with a friend of Nicole Brown Simpson's who's going to tell you that O.J. had a temper, that really wasn't breaking news, but it would become dramatic because the American public was so eager for information about what was going on with OJ. And why was that? Because it had everything that you could possibly want in a scandal. It had a murder. Americans are fascinated by murder. It had a celebrity, O.J. Simpson, one of the greatest football players of all time, the first running back ever to rush for 2,000 yards, a Heisman Trophy winner, a guy who was in the Hall of Fame, a guy who had gone on after his football career to become a successful spokesman first for in commercials and for companies like Hertz, and then as a commentator on Monday Night Football, one of the first athletes to go transition into the booth once his playing days were over, and then to make it in Hollywood movies. O.J. Simpson was that rare crossover athlete who could now also interact with America on a social basis. He could come into your living room and talk to you, and you were very comfortable with him. For a lot of white people, O.J. Simpson was a black guy who didn't seem too black. He didn't seem like a guy who was raised on the streets. You'd hear white people will say this a lot. Oh, he speaks so well. He's well-spoken, which in the estimation of a lot of white people means this is a black person who has been raised with some culture, who is educated, etc. O.J. Simpson fit that bill and therefore was able to cross over into a world that few athletes, and in particular black athletes, could. So you had this unbelievably successful football player who was also incredibly successful in other aspects of his life. The fact he was a black man married to a white woman brought race and racial questions into the equation. The fact that it was LA and there was a ready and willing cast of characters looking for their 15 minutes of fame, eager to be in front of a camera and what that might bring for them. Jonesing for fame, so to speak, made it intriguing as well. And you had an outlet, a news network, CNN, in its infancy, ready to capture it all. And because at this time, cameras had been granted access to the courtroom, you could televise the trial and it would become America's greatest reality show. Reality television wasn't really a thing in 1994. MTV had done the Real World, a couple seasons of the Real World, which was really kind of the first ever quote unquote reality show. And Survivor, I think, was about to launch. It may have launched by 94. I'm not sure, right around there. But that was about it. You didn't have a massive number of reality shows like you do today. The O.J. Simpson trial became the first reality show. It created a culture of voyeurism in America like we had never seen before. We have always been fascinated with celebrities. If you think back to Charles Lindbergh, who way back in 1927 was the first person to ever fly a plane nonstop across the Atlantic Ocean. When he came back to America after flying from New York to Paris, he got 10,000 wedding proposals. They threw a ticker tape parade for him in New York City, and 4 million people showed up to see one guy. Celebrities have fascinated us. People who achieve great things have fascinated us. But what O.J. Simpson did was he took celebrity and mixed it with race and mixed it with crime and mixed it with all these other aspects, fame, etc. And the public was fascinated by it, and we became voyeurs, and we wanted more of that. The O.J. Simpson trial launched an entire network devoted to crime. We now have crime TV. Crime and documentaries about criminals litter our airwaves now. I mean, Netflix and all the streaming services make a killing, no pun intended, on these types of programs because Americans are fascinated by documentaries on crime. Dateline and 2020 and 48 Hours, which used to be real news shows, are now not news shows. They're just criminal investigations into murders because there's a huge appetite for that with the American public. It also created a culture of celebrity. We now have, because of O.J. Simpson, an entire network, the Bravo channel, devoted to creating celebrities out of untalented, ordinary people. The Real Housewives of Wherever features a host of unskilled, untalented, and largely uninteresting people, for my opinion anyway. But for many Americans, we're fascinated with them. They create drama. They're put into situations that are designed to create conflict, etc. People find that interesting. A lot of this came from the OJ trial. You had this weird cast of hangers-on, the Cato Kalins, some of the lawyers and the jurors and the friends of Nicole and the friends of Ron. And of course, the Kardashians. My goodness, the OJ Simpson case launched the Kardashian empire. Robert Kardashian, lawyer for OJ Simpson, best friends with OJ Simpson, married to Kris Kardashian and their three little daughters, Kourtney and Kim and Khloe, who are now all billionaires. We're all shoved in front of the cameras during the OJ affair because the mom wanted to market them. And boy, did she do that well. And they've now created a massive business empire, which started with the OJ case. The OJ case reopened for us our racial divide. Our racial divide hadn't gone anywhere, but in the mid-90s, it felt like some things maybe had simmered down. Yes, we had the LA riots outside of Los Angeles in the wake of the Rodney King affair. But comparatively, if you go back to the 60s and the civil rights movement of the 60s, the early 70s, the race riots in America in the early 70s, things had seemed to quiet down from a racial perspective over the last 20 years. And this really ignited that again. Polls at the time showed that about 3/4 of white people, around 75% or so, believed O.J. Simpson was guilty of those murders, whereas only about 1/4, about 25% or so, of Black people believed that O.J. Simpson was guilty of those murders. The way in which the LAPD treated O.J. Simpson was, for many people, many Black people, a referendum on policing in America, and that their anger and hatred towards O.J. Simpson, much of it the product of many documented assault cases filed, or complaints, I should say, filed by his ex-wife. He was a known domestic abuser, and many people believe that the LAPD had it out for him because of that, but many others believe, no, this is just symptomatic of how police treat Black people in America. And a lot of white people said that's ridiculous, and this conversation emanated. The OJ case also put athletes under a microscope like never before. We had controversial athletes. Cassius Clay, then Muhammad Ali, Lou Alcindor, then Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Bill Russell, athletes who talked openly about their racial struggle, but that was usually race and politics. This was different. This was social. This was the microscope now being directed at the lives of athletes. And it would change forever. You never had any idea. Prior to O.J. Simpson, you didn't have any idea what athlete was dating what celebrity or what happened in their private lives. Today, you know all of it. Aaron Rodgers just signed with the Pittsburgh Steelers. So much of the conversation was about what Aaron Rodgers does outside the football field. Is that going to impact the way he plays the game? Prior to OJ, nobody would have had any idea what the heck Aaron Rodgers did outside the football field, whether he went on dark retreats and met with shaman and dropped psychedelic mushrooms and dated Hollywood actresses. We wouldn't know any of that. This is the product of OJ. The voyeurism that the American public now has is magnified when you bring famous people into the mix, and athletes now are under a microscope like never before. I mean, there have been some positives that have come out of this because of the O.J. Simpson case and the light that it's shown on domestic violence. Congress in 1995 passed the Violence Against Women Act. And as of 2018, which was 23 years removed from the O.J. case and the passage of that legislation, domestic homicides are down in America by over 50%. the O.J. Simpson case did reveal the struggles that many women face with domestic violence and has led to actions being taken to try to create some sort of a resolution. It's also created some changes in our justice system, in law enforcement, the way simple things like the way that evidence is handled, whether or not television cameras will be allowed in a courtroom, etc. There have been massive and enduring changes to America, most of them probably unhealthy. Our fascination with fame and our fascination with voyeurism and our need to try to create a story out of every little possible thing for the ratings of whatever news outlet needs those ratings has, in my opinion, been detrimental to this country. And I'm not saying it wouldn't have occurred without OJ, but OJ was the catalyst. 31 years ago today, June 17th, the Bronco chase, a fundamental moment in the changes that have taken place over the last 30 years in American history. All right, that is our show today. So join me tomorrow, Whiteboard Wednesday. Steve Scanlon will be my guest. Steve's been on the show a couple of times before. We're going to talk about what do coaches do in the summer. What's a summer checklist for coaches? What are the mandatory things you need to get done to prepare your team to play a football season? That'll be a great conversation with Steve. And we're also going to talk about the launch of CoachCast, which is our podcast network for coaches, which will be debuting soon. So join me for that conversation tomorrow. Until then, have a great day, everybody.